Hello, esteemed listeners. Listen, just to let you know, when we recorded today, my mic was not hot, so you can still hear me, but I sound like I'm in a hollow box. Sorry for the inconvenience. We're still on that learning curve. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning, Mom. You are on Wither and Bloom podcast, iCast Guidance. How do you feel right now?
Oh, this is fun.
Yep, there are people listening, so don't say anything inappropriate.
No, I think you should say something inappropriate.
This is exciting. How are you guys doing?
Wonderful. We are doing wonderful.
Great. We're great.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. Anything pressing?
All right. No, I just wanted to know how the show was last night.
It was phenomenal. It was very well produced, very professional.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you guys do your thing. Keep crushing it. And I will talk to you later. I can't wait to hear it.
Love you.
Love you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey everybody, welcome to iCast Guidance, your weekly Dungeons & Dragons and TTRPG podcast, where every week Rich, Garrett, and I pick up a subject around the culture of gaming and discuss it with you. So without further ado, sharpen up those daggers. We're going to get started right now.
Oh, she seems like a really nice lady.
That
She's
show
a
was
very
so
nice
well produced,
lady.
but not as well produced as Wither and Bloom podcast.
That phone call was brought to you by Wither and Bloom podcast.
And just like every week when we start this podcast, I think we're going to start on that.
No, wait, really? That's incredible.
I think we should. I hit the record button.
love that.
I hit the record button and your mom calls that. This is how we do it. This is how we do it.
It sounded great because it was right here.
I think it sounded really good.
That was like weirdly really good audio.
Yeah.
No.
We gotta keep that.
We're taking it.
Mom, you're famous.
How are you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty good.
We're doing pretty good.
Yeah. We have a special guest today. Jay Balsamello is on our show today, as we're going to be talking about lore and storytelling, narrative, immersion, all of those topics that kind of in some way relate to the games that we play in TTRPG worlds. So I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be good.
Hi, howdy. My name's Jay. I'm a 4-year DM, 6-year player. I've been doing D&D 6 years, as I said. Beyond that, I've great love for storytelling, for high fantasy, all that sort of stuff. Super excited to be here. Long-time listener, long-time viewer.
Long-time viewer, long-time listener. That's
For however long this thing has existed, like a year.
And one of the things we're starting to do in sort of being a prerequisite for being a guest on our show is, you have to at least watch or listen more than our freaking players do.
Wow.
Yeah, they suck. Because we definitely listen.
Yeah.
Oh, I listen.
Anyway, you guys, so I'm going to read a listener comment, and I'm only going to read a fragment of a listener comment because one of our regular listeners, Rabbit.com, who I first of all, I can't say enough how much I appreciate their presence on our channel, and the feedback that we get is just phenomenal. So, everything from genuinely insightful and thoughtful comments about the content we make to, when the audio is clipping a little bit, it's sort of like, oh, good, because the learning curve on audio engineering is absolutely steep, and I'm still figuring it out. However, thanks for all of that, for sure. And in this fragment of a comment on last week's show about puzzles, which thanks to all of you for listening to, the question Rabbit.com answers is, my issues with puzzles are always 2 big points. Why is there this puzzle? Just considering the design of the area, like literally, why would someone design an area like that? In the case of something like a doorway or a locked area. And what information can I give to the player that isn't an obvious, these marks match those marks, and that's how you solve it? Because again, why would someone put a puzzle to prevent people's progress, and put hints as to the answer to that puzzle right there? And this is the question we never ask. Right? It's like, why the hell is this puzzle there in the first place? Which I think is a great question. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question to ask because, there's got to have at some point been a designer of that thing. At some point, somebody would have had to figure out the mechanics and not only have the idea for the puzzle in the first place, but actually put in the time to make that puzzle work, presumably with a lot of trial and error. So, what is keeping that puzzle going as opposed to just giving up and putting, a regular lock and key?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think your players can tell the difference between a puzzle that is there because of lore purposes and a puzzle that is there because of game purposes, right? And how much more immersive is it for the puzzle to say something about said villain, maybe how paranoid they are or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I love that because if the puzzle has the answer to the why built into it, the why that Rabbit.com is asking here, or that your players will probably ask, then that's an opportunity for you as the DM or GM to kind of now create another layer of complexity, which I think is fantastic, rather than just being arbitrary.
Yeah, puzzles are a great opportunity to really just build on the world that you're creating and the characters who have to deal with this dungeon. It's a great way to engage the players if they can tell it actually has lore significance, because the pitfall you really want to avoid with puzzles making it just seem like something to waste the player's time while you're working on your next encounter.
Yeah, and so, in the video, we made an accompanying video about puzzles that went with the audio podcast, and in that I used a couple of examples from Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And if you think about that, Indiana Jones is entering this temple to look for the Holy Grail. And on his way to finding the Holy Grail, he has to go through a series of challenges, which to me were totally arbitrary. Why would the person hiding the Holy Grail create a way for someone to find it? Why not? I mean, if the Holy Grail is that sacred and needs to be protected and never found, why not put it in a beautiful chest and bury it 300 feet under the ground? No one will find it there. But instead they put it in this temple, and there's a way to get through why?
And especially if it's called challenges he needs to overcome, in a sense. Is that what you use, the word challenges?
Well, I relate that.
Trials?
Yeah, there's trials. There's challenges that in any hero's journey, there's going to be a series of challenges that they have to overcome. But that's kind of to employ that automatically by saying, here's where we insert the challenges without having the challenges have significance or meaning.
Well, the challenges then being said will imply that someone is meant to earn this.
That's exactly what I was going to say is, that all these challenges, you said, why not just bury it under the ground? But maybe the ultimate designer of that puzzle was well, if they make it through all these things, maybe they deserve to get it.
Yeah, totally.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. Our minds.
Yeah, we were thinking on the same page there.
I get this. And I think this is a good segue into today's topic of, lore and storytelling and narrative and immersiveness, because I think we should make this effort to, one, if you do need to earn something by solving these puzzles, and maybe the puzzles are a test of your devoutness or a test of your wisdom to allow you, only the right person can draw the stone out of the sword out of the stone. The point is that, we're going to talk about lore and storytelling today. And one of the, I think, the foundations of lore. Well, first of all, we should probably define lore and break it apart from storytelling. But the point here is this. When it comes to puzzles, connect them to the story and then try and come up with a reason why a player is going to earn access to a thing and then build that into that puzzle somehow. That's the answer, right? We don't do that, though.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work, and I don't have the perfect, advice on that.
Well, that's why you're a player.
I know. Exactly.
Stay in your lane.
I don't think like that. I just try and do it. I try and figure it out. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I pick things up and put them down.
I'm going to push this button and push that button and figure out what it does.
Got a 7 on investigation.
That's worked for you in the past.
It has. I just push buttons.
Or pull levers.
With the risk of possibly killing party members.
I'm right there with you.
Someone's got to do something.
All right, so let's start off. Let's kind of talk about the difference between lore and storytelling. Because we know that lore is part of story, right? But when we think about lore, what do we think about? What's lore?
When I think about lore, I don't think about the events unfolding in front of our eyes. I think about the events that have unfolded to get us to this place we're in now.
Yeah, the way I think about lore, or the way that I approach it when I'm writing for it, is very much like everything that's happening outside of the players or main characters or protagonists' immediate view. So that could be something that happened like thousands of years ago in, whatever ruins you're currently in. Or it could just be like a side character, like something that happened with them that impacts the story in a greater way.
I mean, these are kind of like the scaffoldings that prop up everything that's happening right now. So one of my favorites, of this is, when we start talking about the history of Sauron crafting the ring, and how the ring sort of came to be and all of the things that sort of go along with that got us to this place in time, and how the ring sort of got itself from Smeagol to Gollum to Bilbo to Frodo. And, now here we are. And where are we going to go with this information? And what treachery lies with that lore that we now have to deal with?
So Garrett, what do you think of when you hear storytelling?
I mean, kind of going off of the premise of how you guys talked about lores, I think the storytelling would be what's happening in the present. Like, as your players, or, what you're reading, if we're relating this to a book or whatever, is what is happening now, what is being created now instead of what was in the past, I would say.
And I think, in terms of TTRPGs, when we're playing the game, and storytelling is happening, what we're really doing is we're story building, right? Because in the moment, we don't understand exactly where this is going. So for me, in some respects, the story building side of it is the unknown, and the lore side of it is the known. That's kind of like, the lore is the framework that we play from. It's like this map, and everything on this map and how it got here and all the stories associated with different cities, towns, and economic systems and political structures and wars. That's our lore. But then we get into this story building part. And I think the whole point of this podcast is to talk about how these things support and enhance one another.
Well, I don't think they can exist without each other. Think about it. Even in like real life or something, like we all have our own lore. We all went through our own day-to-day lives and years on our own lives, and then we come together to interact and do things, in that storytelling, but they can't exist without each other.
Right. But as a key component to world building, so Jay, for example, when we sat down and we were kind of doing a little world building jam session, there were some tricks, there were some techniques that you use to sort of lay some groundwork for your world building that sort of begins to be the seeds for your lore, for your stories. What are some of your favorites? Like, what do you like?
I mean, right off the bat, my favorite go-to method to fleshing out an area in terms of functionality, like how it exists, the sort of biome, that, like the entire setting. One of my favorite questions to ask myself is, what is the dirt like? Just a simple question like that to just describe what the soil in that area is like. For example, in my game, my players recently got out of like a swampy type area. And so when I was sitting down trying to write for this place, I was like, okay, what does the dirt look like? And it doesn't have to be that question specifically. Like if you're in a city, obviously TTRPGs tend to exist in a world where magic is real. So, okay, if there are lanterns on the street, what color is the fire? And how is that impacted? Just a lot of things like that. And then from other perspectives, like, okay, if this scene were to be like animated or filmed or something like that, what would you want the color palette to be like? What would you want the stylization of the scene? What kind of music would you want to be playing in the background? That sort of stuff can really help set a tone for the actual story building, as well as like just impacting the way that you write the lore for that specific place to get the sort of feeling that you want for the story.
Yeah, that's so good. Whenever we're sort of carried back into the lore of any given story, whether we're watching a film or reading a book, the setting of the scene, the detail in the setting of the scene is always very well fleshed out. It's sort of like, okay, let's get that shimmering sort of look to things as we drift back into this space and understand how this happened. The color's brighter. Like, think about, I keep going to this scene. I got to come up with a better scene than this, but I keep going to Smeagol and Deagle. That's where I'm at.
He is stuck.
You got a problem.
Smeagol.
If you've listened to the last like 4 podcasts, I mean, he's in a zone.
One would say it's precious.
Oh, wow. That's right.
That's perfect.
That is my precious. But hang on, bear with me for a second, because if you think about the color palette in the Lord of the Rings, well, actually the Smeagol and Deagle scene in the actual movies comes in, I think it's at the beginning of the Two Towers or the beginning of Return of the King. One of them. We go from a very muted sort of analogous color palette
to a bright summer day, right, on a river, where now we're exposed to water, soil, greenery. It feels bright and lush. And all of a sudden now your senses are just totally tuned into that, right? So that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. The easiest way to get people invested in the lore or whatever it is you've got going on is to make the setting itself appealing. Because if the setting is obviously going to have a lot of history, that's where the lore is going to be found. You know, unless you want to write up like a text document to send your players, which that's not going to invest any of them in the story. You're going to want to describe it well and really get that feeling across so that players feel attached to it, and then go to question more things to ask, okay, so the beach has black sand. How did that happen? Is it like an ashy sort of thing? Like, and if so, where did this ash come from? Was there like a city here? Things like that. If you just say, oh yeah, there's a stone ruin, that's not interesting. They're not going to remember that. We see like thousands of stone ruins a day in this game.
That seems like a really like specific place to start, and that just seems really like freeing, because I feel like you don't really miss a lot of details starting like that specific, you know what I mean? And
yeah, exactly.
It leads you to so many questions.
Yeah, it's because it also helps when players, because we've all had this experience, when a player asks a really specific question about something in the environment that you didn't plan for at all. Starting with specific details about even other things that have nothing to do with it can really help sort of make it easier to come up with things even just on the spot about, oh, what kind of wood and aesthetic is the chair at the tavern? Like, it can really help sort of advance that sort of thing.
Well, I would imagine that if you had an understanding of something that was about the terrain, let's say, you know, we're onto soil now, and then we understand the tree growth in the woods, and let's say it's all a dark wood forest because the trees have a certain pitch to the actual wood growth. And now all of a sudden, all the dark wood that would have been harvested to build the buildings and make the furniture is going to contribute to the aesthetic that we sort of build that space out with. So, and I mean, I think a lot of DMs, this is a lot more detail than they want to tackle, but I feel like that tactile, heavy detailed visual is so key.
We bring it up all the time on the podcast. Those little details are going to help in immersion. Recently, we started a new campaign, a Daggerheart campaign, a small, couple shot series for our channel. And Todd, when we're sitting at the table and he's giving us the introduction to the city that we're going to be playing in, and the words that he used, like it's a seaside town, and he talked about like the seagulls and the smell of the air and everything. I pretty much sat back and closed my eyes, and I was like brought into this space. But all those little things like you talked about, like a black sand beach and like words like that, that's going to help so much in just the building of the story. Really.
Yeah. And to piggyback off that, like when we started playing and Todd was describing how there is like ash all over the place, and there's like pieces of metal and like clank work just laying on the ground. It's just, it paints a picture in your head.
Yeah, well, I mean, think about it. When we're reading a book and our mind sort of begins to turn on the projector and we're seeing that space. This also goes to when we're watching a film and we talked about the moth being on the TV screen. When we go into the theater and your mind projects this space, the more information we have to put in there, the easier the time we have going into that space. And this is funny because my research right now that I'm looking at is about the mind and the brain are two separate things. And this is actually in neuroscience, this is how things are divided. So that it's divided into two areas. The brain is the physical thing and the mind is the intangible, non-physical thing. And of course, we think about the mind as a product of the brain, but which it most certainly is, but the brain is not a product of the mind, right? But here's my point. Sensory input is the physical thing. Because if I describe to you a world where I'm saying, there's this kind of soot on the walls and the trees have this kind of growth, those words are translated by your brain and allow the mind to turn on the projector. So the better job I do of taking you down that road, the more easily you're going to be able to see or immerse yourself in the screen.
if that makes sense.
That makes total sense. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I do want to go on the conveying of lore and how to do it without feeling like you're lore dumping like a Wikipedia page on your players. You know what I mean? How do you do it, Jay?
So one thing that I tend to do, obviously players are going to be most attracted to the things that come from their backstory. That's just a given. It's something that they wrote themselves. So if you sprinkle a little bit of that in there, it's like cocaine for them. They love it. But aside from that, if it really has nothing to do with the player specifically and is more about the overarching story, I like to add an element of confusion there, something that just outright does not make sense about it. So that way the players kind of investigate it and like, wait a minute, why doesn't this make sense? What's happening here? It kind of piques their curiosity. Like how I mentioned with the setting, figuring out things like that. Just as an example, in that swamp park that I mentioned a bit ago, there was this set of ruins there that had been overgrown. However, just looking around the place, the stones that it was made of aren't native to that area, and some of the overgrowth also is not native to a swamp-type area. And then, they see that, begin investigating. Looking through the papers, they find this place wasn't originally here, and somehow this entire ruin had been transported there seemingly mysteriously. So they begin investigating things like that, finding things that just objectively don't make sense and trying to connect those pieces together. Confusion is one of the best ways I find to get players just immediately fixated on something.
Well, that seems like you're doing a lot of showing, not telling, and letting them piece things together, which I think is a really collaborative way of experiencing lore.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely want to make your players feel like they're the ones discovering things. Because if you just hand it to them, it's like, okay, the DM's just going to tell us no matter what we do.
Yeah, but this is where the delicate balance comes in, because as a DM, I find myself frustrated sometimes when I've created a lore situation, I bring it in, I present them with some kind of incongruity that's going to hopefully get them to ask some questions, and it doesn't go in that direction. So, of course, then I have to tune the dial a little bit to maybe enhance a point or push a point a little bit harder to say, you should probably ask a question here. How do we deal with that? Because that's Garrett, when you're a player, you're really good at picking out things in the game that should be looked at. But we all miss stuff.
Yeah, I try, especially when it comes to a period where it's like, maybe it's a puzzle or something, and it's like, okay, there's something we're missing here. But a lot of the times I will miss something, and you tell us all the time, sometimes we're crappy players and we don't ask enough questions, or we're in that bar scenario and we didn't talk to anyone.
Well, yeah, we played Strahd for a year and a half, and in a year and a half, there were only 2 insight checks the entire time.
Hey,
a year in, Todd's like, hey, you guys should check out this mechanic called insight checks. You ever hear of it?
I constantly have to remind my players that NPCs can and will lie to you. They just take everything at face value. It's insane.
Well, and the other thing I think we should remember as players, because, we don't want to totally hog this conversation as DMs and GMs, is there's this balance, and it's hopefully, if I were to divide the pie, if I could make a pie chart of what is arbitrary in my lore and what is not, I'm going to say that is 80-20. 80% of what I put in my lore is intentional and not arbitrary. Only 20% is. So I would say that out of every 5 things that I present to you, 4 of them are going to have questions that you can answer around them. But I don't know how to convey that. I don't know how to get my players to say, wait a minute, you just missed a really significant thing.
Well, I think, sorry, Garrett.
Well, you can go.
Oh, you're such a gentleman. I think that's coming from your selfish desire to have everything that you have beautifully concocted in your head seen and discovered by the players, right? But there's nothing more beautiful than, as a player, let's say even in a video game, something like Bloodborne or something, the lore is so missable. And just because I went down this random path in the woods and found this book on the ground, I discovered so much that I could have missed, and that fleshes out the world so much. But the cost of that is possibly missing things.
I wanted to go, and because you were saying, about that, I wanted to go back to Jay and say, how did your players, did you kind of lead them to say, something is a little off here, or how did they find out that the the growth wasn't really native to the area. Did someone ask that, or did you kind of feed them a little bit of that?
A bit of both. So how it started out was just players running just standard insight checks on the area. One of the players, I think the druid of the group, or maybe it was the sorcerer, I forget who it's specifically, rolled really high, and I just started describing things about it like, oh yeah, some of the foliage doesn't look quite right. Like some of the players are from different regions, so, you know, they're a bit more familiar with like flora and fauna from other places. So some of them's like, hey, you're from a more mountainous region. This kind of matches that, which is odd because right now you're in a swamp. That sort of thing, just kind of leading them based on what experiences they already know, like the characters, I mean. And then what would pique the player's interest. So at that point, you gotta kind of get to know your players a bit more.
You just made me realize something, actually, and this kind of goes back to a word I'm going to push back on what Rich said, because he said it's my selfish desire, which is, it hurts a little bit to hear that, because my selfishness there is really about making you guys have a good time, but we'll get
Oh, here we go.
Anyway.
He's on his soapbox.
Yeah, he really is.
No, I'm not. You know, Garrett, you and Jay are talking about this idea of at what point, and is it a role that causes this? At what point does Jay begin to change the description to say things like, something's not quite right? And that's because you have a high perception or a high investigation, and that character all of a sudden realizes this is out of place. But think about filmmaking. When we're watching a film and a character all of a sudden has an epiphany or a realization, it's because we see through the cutting of the film and the camera angle and the way the camera shows us something, we see what gave them that moment. But in TTRPGs, it's different because no one's handing you that moment. So it is that element that gets slipped into the scene and says, here's the thing you need to know that's going to trip you over the edge and say, you understand that there's an incongruity here. Something's up. That's it. And I never thought about it that way before, but I love the way that just came out.
Yeah. Could you like in a movie, like sometimes like the music will rise and like the tension will rise as like you're getting close to like the clue or something? What if you could find a way to do that in like TTRPGs, like where like you're controlling the sound and like as they're like, it's like a game of hot and cold.
Well, yeah. And this is, I think, the wish of a lot of GMs is to have the perfect, listen, like we love Pocket Bard, for example. Pocket Bard's doing this great stuff with the way their interface runs. But I think the thing I want are 2 sliders in Pocket Bard. Pocket Bard, I hope you're listening to this. And if you're not, I'm sending it to you. But here are the 2 sliders I think every GM would want. 1, a slider that changes the darkness of the mood, right? So we can go from, pleasant to dark. And 2, they already have built this in, but it's an intensity slider, right? But if I had control over those 2 things simultaneously, and they have the intensity thing, but I think the intensity thing still has some kinks to work out. Because, like you hit the explore tab and then you turn up the intensity and the music does get more full and more rich, which I like, but I think I want that to get more, I want it more in like emotion inducing somehow. It does it. Certain playlists of theirs do it differently than others, and I like them, but I want that mood darkener to go with it.
Do you think having some sort of emotion tab to color the scene would work?
I was almost going to say something.
They got a list of different emotions, and they kind of change certain parts of the soundtrack.
Yeah, but I'm just going to go at this from their engineering standpoint. That's going to be hard. These are musicians that are creating sounds, and it's sort of like, okay, this is more than just a digital tweak of a dial, like on a synthesizer, where it's like I can turn this from a sine wave to a square wave. It's like, no, they got to record a whole separate thing. I don't know how this works, but I'm assuming the music has to be recorded and then it's got to be like sort of blended and seamlessly integrated. That's got to be challenging.
Oh, then maybe instead of like a bunch of different emotions, they have like, I don't know, comparatively like a hope and fear kind of like coloring of the scene.
Yeah.
That'd be a really good name for a game, honestly. Hope and Fear. I might have to use that.
So Daggerheart runs on a mechanic of hope and fear. That's I think that's where Rich is pulling that from.
Oh, true. It does pull from that.
Yeah. Hope and fear.
Casual little plug.
Yeah.
A plug for Daggerheart. Go watch on when do you guys do Dagger? When do you guys release episodes? Whenever that is.
Well, we're gonna drop Daggerheart in November, so that's
Come back in November. They've got a thing planned.
Yeah, we do.
Shameless self-plug.
It's going to be incredible.
Thank you for that.
Of course, anytime.
All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about how to incorporate lore into your game, but outside of gameplay, so to speak. So it's a way to kind of build it in non-traditional ways. We'll see you in a few. Hey, esteemed listeners. Listen, if you like what we're up to today and you like the content that we produce here at Wither and Bloom Studios and what we talk about on iCast Guidance, today's request is going to be a little bit different. Sometimes I'm trying to get you to subscribe. Sometimes I'm trying to get you to go over to Patreon and support us. Today, I think I'm going to just ask you to share the word. Tell people that we're out there. Tell people that this podcast exists. Tell people that Wither and Bloom Studios are putting together a good thing. I see comments on our channel all the time that we're underrated. And we really want to grow. We want to talk to more people. We love getting into a bigger community. And I feel like you all can help us do that. So do me a favor this week. Tell a friend we're out there. See if you can get someone to listen. It'd be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get back to the show. All right, so we're back from the break. And that story I told in the break needs to stay out of this conversation. Do you understand me?
It's never leaving this room.
We'll see how I feel. We'll see if you give me what I want in this game we're playing.
This morning we bond like lovers over their firstborn.
What the fuck does that even mean?
It means we made a baby here.
I don't know.
That story is our child.
You know, at some point, I think it would be really cool to live stream these sessions so that the only people that are allowed to watch the live stream are like, I don't know, viewers of ours that have privilege on some level, like people that have been watching us for a long time, or that, you know, because it would be fun to bring some people into these conversations.
Like Bravado and
Bravado and Rabbit.com and some of our, you know, like our regular people.
Mm-hmm.
A couple people get to know as a treat.
Faint Divinity.
Yeah, we get unhinged fairly easily.
Yeah.
These are people that will understand, I think.
They'll get us.
But we can't let the general public into this conversation.
No.
We'll be cooked.
Twitter wouldn't have it.
No.
So listen, when we're talking about lore and the stories framework and the general openness of story building in TTRPGs, it's like, you know, lore is tricky because it's like you want to bring it in, you don't want to do the big lore dump, you want to have a strategic way of making it play. What are some other ways we can do this? I mean, I talked about a lot of tactile things last week in puzzles, but what are some other ways we can do this?
I mean, yeah, there are a ton of different ways. One thing that I've found really gets players invested in the lore and also helps, you know, when they're just kind of like thinking about it outside of session, because we've all had that moment of outside of the session, like it's either just ended or it was a day or two ago, but we're still thinking about it. When that happens, I like to give my players something else to chew through. Whether it be, you know, I'm an artist, so it'll be like a painting or a bit of animation for it, or even just like a piece of writing that exists in universe, but that the players receive not for their characters to read, but for them to read of something else that's going on. Like recently, I handed one of my players, or rather the group as a whole, a little plot blurb of like their adopted children's medical papers just to like sift through and read on their own just to get them thinking about it. You can just hand them little supplemental things that their characters wouldn't necessarily have on hand or know off the top of the bat, but that kind of like connects the world as a whole, that really fleshes it out for them in their minds.
Yeah. I'm doing that right now with the Daggerheart campaign. I'm allowing my players to see the map of the city, where oftentimes the map is not something I give my players. Now I'm like, hey, you live here, so here's what it looks like. You know, learn it, figure it out. I think that's good.
I was going to talk about maps because you sent us that picture of the map of where we're going to be playing, and I dove right in and I started like reading all the little like spots and district names and this location, that location, and like I was like, oh, I'm like, I can't wait to get in here. And that's happened before in games where we're playing and maybe during session we did acquire a piece of a map or something, and then we get that later in our chat or whatever, and it's just like I can't wait to physically look at it, and that brings back kind of like a lore element.
Jay, what was it you had said about like off game?
Yeah, so
just to refresh my memory.
yeah, I'd said that I like to provide my players like supplemental materials, whether it be like an art piece that's based on what's currently happening, or like papers that their character might have, just something for them to chew on that their characters might not have to help flesh things out for them.
Yeah, because one thing I like to do with the Discord server is I like to have channels, private channels that are only accessible by that particular player and myself, so that we have a space to sort of talk about their backstory in conjunction with lore in the story. And so on the side, like during the week when we're not playing, it's sort of like, all right, let's build this out a little bit. Let's give them something. There might be a photo in there of like a fragment of the map or something they find, a book. But yeah, that's a great space to do that.
Absolutely. My Discord has a similar setup. Each of the players has their own channel for their character and everything dedicated to that. And even during session, if they want to ask me something in private, they'll just pop into the Discord channel and just ask away while the rest of the session's still going on. That way their character can ask questions in private, or the player rather, and then I can answer them without having to make like a public sort of...
I think, well, this is something interesting too, is like what aspects of lore inside of your framework are only privy to certain players. And of course, this is probably going to relate to backstory, but then how do your players deal with that at the table, where they know that they've got some chunk of information that's relevant, but it would be metagaming to share that with the rest of the group?
I think that just comes from right time, right place. You know what I mean? If it comes up in the story where it makes sense to convey this to the party, then, let it out. If not, I think you hold on to it. Keep it close to your chest,
Right. I'm just wondering how, I guess this part of me that wants the game there is a part of me that wants the game to have sheer perfection, right? Mm-hmm. I understand that we learn a lot through failure and that sometimes this is never going to be perfect. But I'm like, wait a minute, now you've got privileged information. Does that taint the decision? How could it not taint the decision making?
I think it breeds conflict, right? Let's talk about when one of our beloved characters from a really cool player, Tryphon, decided to exit the campaign for a moment. It's due to information he was holding on to for months at a time.
Right. Right, that's true. That's true. And we'll probably at some point return to the game with even more information now that you've had a significant chunk of time outside of game with a lot of side play. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm not going to, and Tryphon's not going to come back and just be like, so I was doing this. I was here, I was there, I met these people.
Right. But you do come to the table with insider info. Mm-hmm. Right, which is going to, and as a good player, you'll understand when to let that out and when to hold that back. I get that. There's just a part of me that wants this to happen so organically that that's not a factor, but it is a factor.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I'm reading this book on game mechanics and understanding how play functions and understanding how our brains work. And there's this thing about rock, paper, scissors in the very beginning of the book where they did a study around rock, paper, scissors, where they had some people play the game traditionally. They had some people play where one person was blindfolded and the other one was not. And then they had some people play where both people were blindfolded. And in the example where you have one blindfolded and one not, the percentages should suggest there's a win 33% of the time, but it ticks up for losses and ties more than expected. And what this means is that I'm adjusting my decision for what to put out there based on what I'm seeing slightly. And what's weird about it is it's going in an unexpected direction. So I'm wondering if somehow by being the player that has the blindfold off in a TTRPG where you have lore that you come to the table with, how is that affect? Is your decision making actually not working in a way that's like what we would consider cheating or what we consider too much, but it's working against you? We're holding back.
That's interesting. And it's hard to discern that at the moment. I think it goes into the discussion whether like, all right, are we treating this like a game that we're trying to win? Or are we treating it like, this is a character study and we're creating a narrative and doing exactly what our character would do in this moment?
Yeah, that's actually really good because I didn't think about the win-loss thing and that doesn't apply here. So, All right. Okay.
But it's a nuanced conversation. It's interesting.
Yeah, I went off on a tangent there for a second, but I did think about this notion of maybe the insider info of having lore that you're only the one privy to creates a negative impact. That's, I think, my point.
What do you think about that, Garrett?
It's an interesting concept. I mean, having information that you're only privy to, it could persuade, I guess, the way that you release that information, maybe. I mean, if you as the DM is thinking of a way to release that information, it might come off differently as the player. Like the way that the player releases that information, and then you might be like, oh, that's not how I wanted that to be, portrayed or something like that. So I guess there could be like a conflict there.
I think it depends on like the specifics of the piece of information. Because if it's something that the general party should know and only this one guy has it, then, that could be a bit of a negative. However, personally, I love giving my players different pieces of information depending on like their lived experiences, what they would know, what they would gather from a situation. And that helps create, what I find is that it lets the players kind of like figure things out, both independent as just themselves and as a group, kind of like putting a puzzle together. So, I mean, I know last week you were talking about puzzles in like a literal sense, but this is almost like a lore puzzle, if you will. That each scenario can have something that one person might know and another might not. And it just kind of helps them, kind of talk to each other a bit more. Because, obviously you want your players to interact with each other. And of course, there's always, beach episode type interaction, just goofing off. But in terms of like actually getting shit done and getting the lore going, it's great. I find it a great tool to have them know different things. That way they have a reason to like talk things through and figure it out verbally.
And I think that's the ultimate goal, right? That's why we're handing our players these pieces of information, is so that and thank you for articulating the words, the lore puzzle, because that's really what it's about, right? It's like, how do we get our players to come to realizations about these seemingly disparate things each of them knows, to put them all together and say, oh, wait, you know that? Well, that might relate to what I know. What do you think of this? And then all of a sudden it begins to grow.
And I think that like the DM has some like agency over that, because like there are moments when we have whispers and we go in the other room and the other players like know that that character is getting information that the rest of the party isn't. So when we come back, like sometimes the players are like, why are they acting differently? Can I get like an insight check on them? Right? Yeah. And that's where you can kind of like push that if you want.
Right.
Right.
So. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then there is also something about the idea of taking a player out of the room to give them that private information. Just that act and sort of you're telling the rest of the players, here's something you don't know. And so now that hopefully spurs them into, a thought process. It says, we got something to figure out here. There's something going on we don't know about. All right, so this conversation really talks a lot about how a lot of us as DM and GM are, sort of presented with challenges. But what about the players? Like, how do players prefer to receive these tidbits and packages of information and lore? Like, what do you guys like?
I mean, like I was saying before, I really get immersed and involved, seeing a piece of a map, because it relates to where we are in the location or the surrounding areas. And I know in the past, playing in some of Todd's games, we've gotten like letters before. And like, you read through this letter, and I think it was in Strahd, and it was a letter to or piece of a journal or something like that. I personally love tactile things in front of me. It really gets me, I guess, involved in it. I want to read through this. I want to look at it. I mean, I guess the same thing kind of goes for in a Discord chat, getting it. But if I get a physical copy, I'm really going to connect with that a lot more in my aspect. That's just how I am.
Yeah. And being the sculptor, I want to give you that stuff.
Yep. You're pretty good at doing that, handing stuff out.
So. Rich, what about you?
I think like a lot from like kind of said what I said earlier, like from a video game perspective, like I like to find lore on my own, right? I like to feel like I had some agency in discovering this lore. You know what I mean? Because I don't know, that feels more organic and it feels like it's special to me. It's a fine line between what's necessary and what's not necessary as far as motivations and getting people to feel like they're locked in and they're invested in the story, right? Because even in games like, let's say, Dark Souls and whatnot, like I mentioned earlier, like the way they drop lore is incredible, but sometimes like they don't make it the motivations and the whys of the world regularly apparent. So it's sometimes hard to get invested beyond like a pure like video game Twitch like reflexes type of vibe. You know what I mean? When in a game like a D&D, you need to walk that balance better because you can't rely on like, oh, this feels like really good to play. In a sense, when D&D does, but like you need to convey the why a lot more. I feel like when you're playing TTRPGs.
Well, yeah, because video games kind of come preloaded with a whole bunch of stuff you didn't normally have. From the visuals and the sound, that's all there, right? But then you've also got this whole history of, you know, like cut scenes that are going to like fill things in. And so there's a lot that, you know, that the
Different medium.
Yeah, totally. But I like this idea that you kind of are about the reward centers in the brain, right? Where it's sort of like, oh, I did a thing, and here's the thing I got for doing that thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because it's going to continue to make you want to do it and bring a worth to your party.
Right.
You know?
Right.
I feel like the problem with video games, in my aspect of looking at them, in a TTRPG, we don't necessarily know the world. And I mean, I think that's why you spend more time on the lore. If you're given something, you really look into it because you're trying to story tell this story. In a video game, like if I play like Baldur's Gate, how many books do they give you, or how many things can you read in that game? You could spend 100 hours reading all the little books and stuff that you pick up on the bookshelf, but I don't. I just throw them in my bag and I keep playing the video game because it's a video game. And I'm more drawn to, all right, let's just go, you know, attack the next person. But I think in a TTRPG, when you don't have that, I think you connect with it a little more. Well, I don't know.
I agree, yeah. Because like when you discover those things in a video game, it doesn't change the outcome of the story. But when you do it in a TTRPG,
it does. Yes.
Well, and the best, you know, so in Baldur's Gate, if I'm finding like 19 books on bookshelves, I'm going to open them long enough to see if I get any kind of buff for opening.
Oh, that's exactly. You've got to open every single book.
Yeah, exactly. You open them, and if you get some kind of buff, okay, great, that worked. Boom, throw that one away. Let's go to the next one.
That's so funny. Imagine that in a TTRPG, like you open the book and you just like flip it upside down and kind of like flick through it to see if like a photo falls out or something.
Exactly. But the other thing about that is a DM or GM is never going to have the time to make as many books as one could find in Baldur's Gate. So you know if you get that book in the TTRPG, that means something.
It means something.
That's important.
You got to look into it.
Yeah.
Jay, what about you? Players at your tables, like how do they like to receive it? Have you fleshed that out?
It really depends on player-to-player basis. Some of them like having lore just like directly, not narrated to them, but like, you know, more complex aspects of the lore stated directly to them. Others prefer like more environmental sort of storytelling. Like, oh, this place constantly has monsoon, so of course this is what they think of the local rain god. This is what they think of, you know, the concept of water itself, and, you know, things like that being told from the environment and just lore kind of building on itself. So it really depends on the specific player. I know when I'm playing like video games and stuff, my favorite type of way to receive lore is just to not even like the act of like finding a book or something. I like the existence of implied lore. Like the sort of lore where there doesn't need to be like any sort of dialogue or actual word spoken, but you can still glean what's going on. Like one of my favorite examples is the game Little Nightmares. That and Shadow of the Colossus. I don't know if any of you have ever played Shadow of the Colossus. You're not actually receiving a ton of, I think the only lines of dialogue you receive in that game are from the actual like dark god character in Shadow of the Colossus. But you still know what's going on, you still understand the lore, and you can still get a grasp of what's happening. Same with Little Nightmares, same with every game in that kind of genre.
And is that because that lore is just condensed in the right way? I haven't played either of those games, but is that because it's condensed in the right way, or is it just because due to the sheer simplicity of it?
It's more so because every aspect of the game is like teeming with that sort of lore. Like, for example, Little Nightmares, you can very quickly realize that you're on a boat, not because of anything particularly nautical happening, but because of just the gentle sway of the camera as if you're on a boat. Things like that, like every aspect of the environment tells its own story.
Yeah, and like, even the players, even the like villains in Little Nightmares, like these giant gluttonous creatures compared to like your little character, like it tells the story about them and what they're doing in this world.
Exactly. And even just the moments where you're sneaking around these like monstrous creatures and you're just watching them do whatever. Like there's this one scene where the first creature you encounter, Roger, the janitor, he's got these long arms, and one of the first scenes that you have with him, or maybe towards the middle, I can't remember exactly where it occurs in the game, is that you're sneaking around him while he's in just his office, and you can see him like binding up the bodies of other children like yourself and sending them down like these hooks. Later on in the game, you find out where these hooks go to, and it's to the kitchen. Then later on, you find the actual dining hall, and then later on, you see like the sort of matron of this place. Every aspect of the story is sort of building on itself, and even just incidental things like you'll have to cross a lake of sorts, but it's not water, it's just a pile of shoes that could fit your character. Like, where did all these shoes come from?
Gotcha.
Just little aspects of the environment that you can see.
So it's kind of like a really, really fine distillation of the information into just what you need to pose questions. And
Exactly.
Where did all these shoes come from? Where are those hooks traveling to?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And there's a sense of respect that goes along with that.
Oh, absolutely.
Respect of the player's intelligence.
Yeah, like the lore doesn't treat you, like a PBS show where they have to explain every single thing, like, oh, this is who this is and this is why this is happening.
Right.
It lets you kind of figure things out. It treats you like an adult, and I love media like that lets you kind of work things out on your own.
And that is what goes towards my selfish need as a DM to want this game to work perfectly. It's like, I don't want to explain everything. I want it to kind of come out in those types of questions, but I don't have the advantages of a video game where I can just roll it out as a beautiful cutscene or even part of the graphics that you're sort of immersed in and moving through. I don't have that. So I've got to find a way to get between that.
Because when that happens and you respect the audience like that, then it breeds discussions afterwards. Discussions like we're having now on this podcast.
And it all comes full circle. Welcome to the podcast.
All right, listen, I want to remind everybody to please like and subscribe because that's really important to us. And I love this conversation today. Jay, thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your wisdom here.
Of course, anytime. I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, we'll definitely have you. And to you two who are constantly, riding me about things, I now have to go and cut this whole thing up and take out all the insults you've thrown my way.
That's why we do it.
Maybe not all of them.
Horrible things they've
That's why we
said.
do it, and we can't be recasted. We're protected.
Yeah. They're essential. They've unionized.
They're union. All right, everybody, listen, thank you once again for listening to iCast Guidance. We will have another show for you next week, and we look forward to having you along for the ride. We'll talk to you soon. Take care, everybody. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening to iCast Guidance. iCast Guidance is produced by Todd Lambrix, Garrett Brennan, and Rich Froman. We drop this podcast every week, and we are looking forward to having you hang out for more. Don't forget to head on over to Wither and Bloom Studios on YouTube, follow our channel, and definitely comment on what you see there. We will probably read those on this show. Thanks again for listening. We look forward to next time.